Hey friends, guess who's going to CrimeCon UK? CrimeCon, the world's #1 true crime event, is coming back to London from Saturday the 10th to Sunday the 12th of June 2023. Get inside the mind of serial killers and psychopaths, learn from leading criminologists, hear from the families and survivors, meet your favorite true crime podcasters, immerse yourself in forensic evidence, and delve deeper into unsolved crimes. CrimeCon is the ultimate true crime weekend partnered by CBS Reality, the expert-led true crime TV channel. I will be there, so come and join me. Use quote consequence for a special 10% discount. Tickets are on sale now. For more information, visit crimecon.co.uk and use code consequence to save 10%. If you love true crime, then you need to go. There's going to be content creators with more than 30 of your favorite podcasters, including me. True crime YouTubers, there'll be a live recording studio with audiences. Join me at CrimeCon UK. Go to crimecon.co.uk and use code consequence to save 10% off on your tickets. I can't wait to see you there.
Hey, true advocates, and welcome to another episode of True Consequences. I'm your host, Eric Carter-Landin. Today, I'm going to be telling you about one of the most significant events in New Mexico history, the Pueblo Revolt. While the Pueblo Revolt didn't permanently drive the Spanish out of New Mexico, it was successful in ending years of cruelty and exploitation upon the Pueblo people by Spanish settlers. My name is Eric Carter-Landin, and this is True Consequences. There have been several uprisings before the revolt, but they had only succeeded in furthering the abuse. The Pueblo Revolt gave the tribes autonomy and freedom. The Spanish arrived in what was later to become the New Mexico Territory in 1540. They were led by Francisco Vázquez de Coronado. The expedition was a commercial enterprise funded by the Viceroy Mendoza of Mexico City and Coronado's wife, Beatriz de Estrada. Coronado married Estrada within a year of his arrival in Mexico. She was the daughter of Alonso de Estrada, who was the former colonial treasurer. When he married Beatriz, he became the owner of one of the largest estates in New Spain. Between Beatriz and Mendoza, they could afford to speculate on the expedition to the lands north of Mexico. They heard rumors that there was gold, silver, and silk and spice routes from the Indies. Coronado brought 2,000 troops with him on the expedition. They came upon the Zuni village of Jaica. Coronado and his men attacked and pillaged the village, killing most of the inhabitants. They found no riches, but the people had food, clothing, and other supplies, so they took all they could from the village, leaving the survivors to fend for themselves. Coronado hadn't planned for the harsh conditions that southern New Mexico is known for. They hadn't brought along enough water or food to make it across the high desert. This, combined with the fact that there were no riches, the soldiers became angry and murderous. By the time they arrived at the Pecos Pueblo, the people there had heard of the attack on Jaica. Representatives from the Pecos tribe offered to guide Coronado and his men to the wealthy tribes that lived in the east. They were actually going to deliver them to the other tribes that were known to raid their village. This, of course, was going to be very helpful to the Pecos Pueblo in two ways. First, they could gain favor with the Spanish. The Spanish were bringing trinkets and things that they may have been interested in themselves. They also brought horses, sheep, and steel. Secondly, they could rid themselves of the raiders from the east. It seemed like a win-win, but it didn't work. The Spanish attacked the Pecos Pueblo and continued attacking and pillaging villages throughout New Mexico. They killed many, taking what they needed by force. When they arrived at the Tiwa Pueblo, it was winter, and the people had laid aside corn stalks to cook and heat their homes with. Coronado and his men fed the corn stalks to their livestock. This left the people of the Tiwa Pueblo hungry and cold. The Spanish soldiers also raped many of the women in the camp. angering the people of the village. The Tiwas retaliated against the Spanish in December of 1540. They killed some of the livestock that the Spanish had brought with them. Coronado became angry and declared a war of fire and blood on the Tiwa people. He dispatched soldiers to the Arenal Pueblo, where he killed all the men and most of the women in the village. The women who were left alive were enslaved for the remainder of Coronado's time in New Mexico. The Tiwa never recovered from the devastation that the Spanish had wrought on them. Coronado only stayed in New Mexico for 2 years. He left in 1542, and it would be 39 years before the Spanish would return to the area. During the 2 years that Coronado explored the area, he destroyed 12 Pueblo villages and attacked several more. The Spaniards would steal food and clothing from the villages, often killing the people as they moved through. By 1595, King Philip II of Spain had granted Governor Juan de Oñate permission to settle and explore the region. In 1598, Oñate left Mexico to explore what is now the desert southwest, attempting to establish a permanent settlement there. Oñate divided the territory into 7 provinces and dispatched priests to each one. While Coronado's men were sent to find riches, Oñate was there to create settlements and convert the tribes to Catholicism. His first order of business was to reduce the number of pueblos by consolidating them so that it would be easier to control them and convert them and, of course, tax them. This policy was known as Reducciones de Indios, or the reduction of the Indians. The Spanish crown set up an encomienda system that forced the indigenous people of the pueblos into slave labor so that they could pay tribute to the colonists. They were forced to work for them, cleaning their homes and taking care of their crops. Then they were also forced to give a portion of their crops to the settlers as tribute. Under the repartimiento system, the natives were supposed to be paid for their labor, but they were instead taken as slaves to work in the mines or on the farm so that the colony could have food and goods. Under the system, the tribal people were again heavily taxed. When they couldn't pay the taxes, they were beaten or starved. Women and children weren't exempt from these systems. Everyone was supposed to pay their fair share to the Spaniards. They were put to work in the mines and the fields, and the women were often subject to sexual abuse at the whims of the colonizers that they were enslaved to. These systems put a strain on the tribes, causing them to fight back several times. But they weren't organized, so their resistance came with heavy consequences. In 1598, the Acoma Pueblo refused to pay the food tax put on them by Oñate. Because of this, the Spanish chose to invade the pueblo and take what they wanted, leaving the people there with nothing. The leader of the Acamas, Zutacapan, found out about this plan, and being well aware of the cruelties of Spanish invasion, he first tried to negotiate with them. Oñate sent his nephew, Captain Juan de Zaldivar, to the pueblo to speak with Zutacapan. Negotiations broke down when Zaldivar demanded food as tax. Zutacapan denied him the food, telling him that there wasn't enough to feed his people and the Spanish. Zaldivar and his men raided the village and assaulted some of the women. This began a confrontation between the warriors of the village and Zaldivar's men. When the dust settled, Zaldivar and 11 of his men were dead. The survivors returned to the province and told Oñate about the battle. Oñate then sent Zaldivar's brother, Vicente, to punish the Acoma. Zaldivar arrived at Acoma Pueblo on January 21st, 1599, with 70 soldiers in tow. The battle raged for 3 days, and on the 3rd day, Zaldivar and 12 of his men ascended the mesa and opened fire on the Acoma Pueblo with a cannon. Then they stormed the village and killed 500 people, 300 of which were women and children. 500 more were taken captive and sentenced to a variety of horrible fates. Every male over the age of 25 had their right foot cut off. Then they were enslaved for 20 years. 24 warriors were sentenced to this punishment. All males between the ages of 12 and 25 were enslaved for 20 years, along with all females over the age of 12. 60 of the youngest women were sent to Mexico City to be parceled out among the Catholic converts. Most historians believe these women were instead sold as slaves. 2 Hopi men were also arrested during the raid. They were only visiting the Acoma Pueblo, but when they were captured, they were punished as well. They had their hands cut off as a warning to the Western Pueblos not to refuse the Spanish anything they asked for. After that, none of the Pueblos revolted against the Spanish for many years. Oñate was recalled to Mexico City in 1604, where he was put on trial for his cruel conduct toward the Pueblo people and the colonists. Many of the colonists weren't happy in Nuevo Mexico, and they tried to leave. Upon hearing that the people were abandoning the settlements, he would have them tracked down and beheaded. For his cruelty to the natives and his own people, he was exiled from New Mexico and never allowed to return. He was banned from Mexico for 5 years. This forced him to go back to Spain, where he died in 1626. In 1607, Don Pedro de Peralta, the governor of the province, established La Villa Real de la Santa Fe de San Francisco de Assisi, today known as Santa Fe. The city became the regional capital in 1610. Oñate, like Coronado before him, was more interested in finding riches, but, as Coronado had found, there were no cities of gold, no minerals to dig up, no treasure, and no East Indian trade routes to pillage. The Franciscan priests who accompanied Oñate and the settlers were only interested in saving souls. King Philip II only allowed Oñate to embark on this mission because he wanted the land to become part of the Spanish Empire, and because he believed that the Franciscans were doing very important work in the name of the church by converting the native people to Catholicism. He knew there was no silver, no cities of gold, no riches, but there were souls, and those souls needed saving. Often the tactics used to force the tribes into Christianity were cruel and abusive. Beatings and torture were not uncommon, and there was never-ending slavery. It was the goal of the Franciscan priests who came with the settlers to convert the people of the Pueblos to Catholicism, and many Pueblos did convert to Christianity. In fact, the majority of the Spanish armies would be manned by converted Pueblo people by the early 17th century. These men would go on enslaving expeditions and raids against non-Pueblo people. There were many people of the tribes who would be openly Christian while secretly practicing their cultural faith at home. After all, these religious practices had been ingrained in them for centuries. By 1675, the Pueblo people were more open about practicing their religion. They were holding kachina dances and worshiping according to their cultural practices. The Spanish did not like this and chose to stop them by force. By this time, Juan Francisco Trevino was governor of Santa Fe. Trevino was adamant that the Pueblo people would become Catholic inside and out. They would assimilate or die. He ordered his men to go to each village and destroy any religious icons that the Pueblos had. Kachina dolls, ceremonial masks, and prayer sticks were all confiscated from the tribal people and burned. He banned kachina dances and other ceremonies. Then later that year, he arrested 47 medicine men. He accused them of sorcery and plotting a rebellion. All of the men were publicly beaten, and all but 4 were sentenced to 20 years of enslavement. The 4 who were not enslaved were considered the most dangerous of the group. Of these men, 3 were hanged, and 1 committed suicide while in Spanish custody. San Juan warriors paid Trevino a visit after the hangings and demanded that the 43 remaining medicine men be freed. They told Trevino that if he refused to free the men, they would kill him and his family. Trevino freed the remaining men. This time was a time of hardship for the Pueblos. They needed their culture and their religion. Famine and drought had taken over the land. Starvation and murder at the hands of the Spanish took many, and disease took many more. It was a time when prayer was necessary. Hope was vital for survival. There were approximately 80,000 people living amongst the Pueblo tribes before the Spanish colonized New Mexico, and just before the revolt in 1680, the numbers had dwindled down to about 17,000. From 80,000 to 17,000. Let that sink in for a minute. Out of the arrest and torture of the medicine men, a leader stepped up. Pope was one of the 47 medicine men who had been arrested and beaten by Suffer. He had enough. There had been smaller uprisings over the course of the years, but as in the case of the Acoma uprising in 1598, they all pretty much failed miserably, and rather than accomplishing anything against the cruelty of the Spanish, it only made their lives worse. Pope had a bigger vision. He was planning a large uprising, but it would only work if all the tribes could unite as one and push the Spanish out of New Mexico. His biggest task was getting the tribes to unite. The pueblos were scattered over several hundred miles, and each tribe spoke a different language. Many of the tribes were at odds with other tribes, and disagreements between them could be fierce. Popé had a way to overcome all of this. Popé was Tewa, from the pueblo north of Santa Fe called Oke Owenge, which means place of the strong people. And Popé was indeed a strong person. He was affable and congenial, but he was also resourceful and fierce. After the Spanish released him from custody, he went to the Taos Pueblo. This pueblo sat on the very northernmost outpost of the Spanish Empire, and they were known to resist Spanish rule. So, Popé thought that this would be the perfect place to plan the uprising. By this time, every pueblo had someone there who could speak Spanish rather fluently, and Popé had learned several of the languages of the pueblos through trade and ceremonial celebrations when all the tribes would gather together. Popé began traveling the long distances to meet the leaders of each of the local tribes. The trips fell during trade gatherings and saints' days so that they could be disguised as normal meetings. But during these meetings, he preached insurrection against the Spanish. He traveled for several years before he gained the support of most of the pueblos and some of the nomadic tribes. The northern Tiwa, Tewa, Towa, and Keres-speaking tribes of the Rio Grande Valley, the Pecos Pueblo, which lay 50 miles east of the Rio Grande, the Zuni and the Hopi from 120 to 200 miles west of the Rio Grande, all joined in on planning the revolt. Surprisingly, even the Apache and Navajo, who were considered enemies of the Pueblo people, joined in. Common enemies will make rivals friends, even if it's just for a short time. The only pueblos that Popé did not converse with about the revolt were the 4 southern Tiwa pueblos that lived near Santa Fe in what is now Socorro. Popé feared that because they were more assimilated to the Spanish culture, that they couldn't be trusted to rebel against the colonists. He feared that they would tell Spanish authorities in order to gain favor with them. Popé was very secretive about the revolt and insisted on such tight security that he had his son-in-law, Nicolas Bua, killed because he was a Spanish official, and Popé felt that he couldn't be trusted. From 1675 to 1680, Popé planned and gathered forces. He elected runners to go between each pueblo with messages. Runners had to be used because the Spanish didn't allow the Pueblo people to use horses. Any native caught riding a horse would be shot on sight. On August 9th, the first set of runners were sent to the participating pueblos. They were sent with lengths of rope with knots tied in them. The tribal leaders would untie each knot on each morning until all the knots were untied. When the rope was free of knots, that would be the day that they attacked. One of the runners betrayed Popé, though, and told Spanish authorities about the ropes and what they meant. The Spanish thought they had enough time to prepare for the uprising since there were still 4 knots in the ropes, so they thought the attacks wouldn't begin until August 13th. But this was a ruse on the part of Popé. He knew that there were runners he couldn't trust, so a short time after the first set of runners left, a second set of runners who were deemed more trustworthy left with the real time of the attack. This was to be at sunrise the following morning. On August 10th, the tribes of the Southwest rose with the sun and began attacking the settlements closest to them. Popé gave orders to raze the missions and kill the resident priests and as many Spanish settlers as they could. When this was finished, they would head to Santa Fe so all the tribes could convene and kill or expel the rest of the Spanish settlers. Santa Fe was the only town of any significance among the 7 provinces in Nuevo Mexico, and it only had about 170 soldiers to defend the city. The rest of the 2,400 Spanish settlers and native servants were scattered among the outlying provinces. These provinces had relatively little in the way of protection, so when they were attacked, they had no stronghold, there was no fighting back, they had to flee or die. The tribes gathered their horses, food, livestock, and weapons of the fleeing Spaniards as they went, and they all united in Santa Fe to make their final stand against the Spanish. They laid siege to the town of Santa Fe, keeping the residents locked down. Food and water shortly became scarce. Several of the Spanish settlers were wounded, including Governor Trevino. Seeing that the situation was dire, the governor planned a counterattack. He and a small group of slaves and soldiers broke out of the plaza and attacked the natives by surprise. They set fire to the south end of town, killing many of the warriors and capturing 40 of the insurgents. This allowed them to at least get water for the settlers on their way back. The prisoners were held hostage for a short time and then they were shot. The colonists, who numbered about 1,000 people, chose to surrender when the food and water ran out. They chose to leave Santa Fe and head to their stronghold in El Paso. It was here that they met up with 1,500 survivors from Isleta, both groups gathering their remaining belongings and heading for Mexico. The tribes escorted them out of their lands as far as El Paso, making sure that none of them returned back. The siege ended on September 21st, 1680. That day, Don Pedro de Peralta sent a letter to King Philip. It told of the uprising and the siege. Because we now found ourselves with very few provisions for so many people, and without hope of human aid, considering that our not having heard in so many days from the people on the lower river would be because of them all having been killed, like the others in the kingdom, or at least being or having been in dire straits. With the view of aiding them and joining with them into one body so as to make the decisions more conducive to His Majesty's service, on the morning of the next day, Monday, I set out for La Isleta, where I judged and said comadres on the lower river would be. We went as far as the Pueblo of Alameda, where we learned from an old Indian whom we found in a maize field that the lieutenant general, with all the residents of his jurisdictions, had left some 14 or 15 days before the return to El Paso to meet the wagons. About 400 colonist men, women, and children were killed during the revolt, including 21 Franciscan priests. The rest were driven out. It would be many years before the Spanish would return to the territories. After the Spanish had been driven out, Pope named himself the Grand Ruler of the Pueblos and took his place in the governor's palace. In his anger, he ordered that anything that the Spanish had brought with them be destroyed. He demanded the burning of crucifixes and other religious icons, but he also ordered the destruction of livestock and horses and the upheaval of Spanish crops. In his wrath, Pope destroyed not only religious oppression, but the good things that the Spanish had brought. Ironically, the one thing that he kept from the colonists was their love of control and riches. He demanded that the tribes pay tribute to him for driving the Spanish out. His demands caused discord among the tribes, and their unity began to break down. This led to more suffering among the Pueblo people. When the Spanish returned in 1693, they came back to a land that was in drought. The people were starving and vulnerable. Only the Hopi in the far west were able to remain free of Spanish control. The reoccupation of Nuevo Mexico was not peaceful. Warriors from several pueblos took up the fight to keep the colonizers out of their lands. At one point, 2,000 Pueblo people took refuge at Tuño, where the Spanish laid siege to their village. This was no small affair. The Pueblos stayed locked down for months until they ran out of food and water and eventually surrendered. After the Spanish returned, there had been several punitive attacks on the Pueblos and several offers to negotiate settlement. In 1683, the Pecures Pueblo sent an emissary to Governor Oderman, offering aid in the Spanish re-entry to Nuevo Mexico in exchange for peace and an agreement not to kill the Pueblo people or burn their homes. But the Spanish continued to attack the Pueblos. They struck Santa Ana in 1687 and Zia in 1689. In 1692, Governor Diego de Vargas left El Paso with the intention of reoccupying Santa Fe. He and his armies brought 2 cannons and surrounded the town. The tribes agreed to negotiate, and de Vargas was able to reclaim Santa Fe without a fight. There were 2 more revolts against the Spanish after this, one in 1694 and another in 1696. De Vargas' army was able to crush both of them handily. Though there was still resentment between the tribes and the Spanish, there was greater peace between the two. The friars returned with the Spanish settlers, but forced labor and suppression of native culture and religion became a thing of the past. During 1700s, there was a great harmony among the people in New Mexico, and in 1820, the Pueblos were granted equal citizenship in the provinces. The Pueblo Revolt is the only known successful native uprising in the history of the United States. It was the only battle that drove the colonists out and kept them out for several years after. The revolt is significant even today, since not only did the tribes run the colonizers out, but after they came back, the tribes gained their autonomy, and the Pueblos were the only tribes who were not forced to leave their native lands. They were allowed to maintain their sovereignty, their language, and their culture. During 2020, protesters in Albuquerque marched on an area of Old Town where a statue of Oñate stood, depicting him leading settlers to New Mexico. They demanded that the statue be taken down out of respect for the many Pueblo people who had died under his cruelty. The statue was removed. Those of Spanish heritage, many of them descendants of the original colonists, believed that Oñate was a pioneer. He brought livestock, horses, crops, and missionaries to the new land. The people of the Pueblos don't see it that way. They are descendants of those who were oppressed and killed when the Spanish came. Many of them are descendants of those who participated in the revolt. They see the area where Oñate's statue stood as Tewa land, and they were vehemently opposed to having the statue remain. There is no right or wrong when it comes to the feelings of the people of New Mexico, but it should be acknowledged that there were injustices done to the people who lived here. And while we can't erase history, and definitely we shouldn't try to, we should be more transparent about the things that happened in the past. The wounds that the Spanish occupation opened 400 years ago are still fresh in the state, and it may take many, many more years for those wounds to heal. Thanks for listening, and stay safe, New Mexico. I just want to give a shout out to all of my Patreon subscribers and Apple subscribers. I also want to thank Jackie Moranti for writing and researching this script. Again, you knocked it out of the park. And I'd like to thank the newest addition to the team, Trevin. Trevin is our new editor. Thank you so much for all the work that you do. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you to everybody who supports this show and helps keep the lights on. Thank you again. I could not do this without you.